In very broad terms, the security arrangements transition could be broken down into three phases. The ceasefire with all its steps, the transitional security, and the final status of forces. The ceasefire is pretty obvious what it's about. It's about stopping fighting, withdrawing the forces, disengaging them. The final status of the forces is pretty obvious what it's about. It's about the integration of the rebel forces, a new command, the agreement about the final status of the military as part of the comprehensive peace agreement. The part I think is neglected all too often is the middle bit, and that's the transitional security management phase. And during that phase you're looking at the parties taking up joint responsibility to manage the ceasefire, to manage the security during the period. So one party might have been dominant, you now have a ceasefire in place and you move to joint security management. The two parties for the very first time start to work together. And I think it's important because that's the period during which you're creating the confidence and the conditions and the understanding between the two parties that it's possible for them to cooperate in an endeavour. And the first endeavour they're going to cooperate in is jointly managing their ceasefire. The parties start to come to know each other, start to recognise that they are able to work together, that they can overcome differences through political dialogue. But this phase, the middle phase, transitional security phase, is very often skipped or raced through because of the pressure to reach a final agreement. And that's counterproductive because racing to get a deal signed is not allowing the parties to actually have that period of time to mature, to create confidence, to build understanding, even capacity actually to manage security, particularly for the rebel forces. So I think we need to spend much more time on transitional security management. I think that also applies particularly in Africa in the context of the very chronic endemic conflict we have in the continent still to this day. We're very ambitious. We want to reach settlements and resolve and solve conflict. I think we have to be much less ambitious and find ways to manage conflict. We may not always find the immediate solutions, and that's another reason why the transitional joint security management approach is so important. Because what we're looking for perhaps is ways in which conflicting parties can come together and not necessarily immediately resolve all their issues, but start to actually address the conflict side of the problem and manage the conflict, bring it under control, create conditions in which there's more political space. And I think that's the final point I'd make on that, is that, as in the case of the Abuja talks in Darfur, the huge pressure that was placed on the parties by the key international players, the United Kingdom and the United States, both of those countries pushed very hard for a final agreement, which was not achievable, was not realistic. The parties had no capacity to reach a comprehensive political agreement. Neither were they representative. What could have been achieved was a ceasefire, an effective one. Had we focused purely on that ceasefire and achieved that, which I think was possible, one of the things we would have done is created conditions in Darfur for more representative delegations to emerge for political talks. And that's part of the problem about sharp conflict, is that sharp conflict creates conditions in which the delegations and the representatives are normally the strongest military players, not necessarily the most representative players. Large parts of communities, including women, are removed from the process precisely because of this circumstance in which only people with military capacity are engaged. So I also think we need to take some time using the ceasefire and management of security to create conditions for subsequent stages of talks.